The purpose of the symposium is to consider history and national identity as tools for community regulation, and in this presentation I'm going to focus on representations of history as cultural tools that reflect and promote action in the service of national identity. Everybody knows the rhyme. I'll just ask for one of you to say what happened in 1492. In 1492. Thank you. So thus begins the rhyme that generations of US children learn to commemorate, right, Columbus's voyage as a defining moment of national history and global progress. Indeed, Columbus remains a central figure of US national origin myths and is one of the two individuals who, along with Martin Luther King, warrant their own federal holidays. However, Columbus did not always figure so prominently in US national imagination. Rather, this heroic status was a result of various sorts of collective action in anticipation of the 400th anniversary of his voyage. So several identity groups within the US appropriated this event to successfully advance their causes, and it was Columbus Day activism that led to the adoption of two of the most important national symbols nationwide, including, of course, the presence of a US flag in every classroom and the daily pledge of allegiance to that flag. A century later, during the 500th anniversary, Columbus Day became the site for a very different form of collective action, since anti-colonial activists staged protests challenging the myth of discovery and demanding the transformation of Columbus Day into a commemoration of genocide. As a result of such efforts, some US cities and states such as Berkeley, California, and South Dakota reconstructed the holiday as a celebration of indigenous peoples. So, drawing upon this case of Columbus Day, we're going to apply a cultural psychology perspective to examine representations of history as tools for collective regulation of national identity. From a cultural psychological perspective, representations of history serve as intentional worlds. That is, they are cultural tools invested with a psychological charge that both reflects and promotes particular beliefs and desires. In one direction, mainstream representations of history are not just neutral, natural renderings of objective facts. Rather, their dominance reflects a dynamic process whereby people preferentially select and reproduce certain versions of past events and incrementally reproduce these representations that materialize their beliefs, their values, and desires associated with national glorification. For example, our previous research on this topic showed that people with high investment in national glorification reproduce nation-glorifying versions of history and tend to deny or silence representations that might pose a threat to national identity. And in the other direction, representations of history are not just inert artifacts. Instead, these representations carry a psychological charge that directs subsequent experience and action toward the fulfillment of collective ends. Again, our previous research on this topic suggests that celebratory representations of national identity often promote nation-glorifying forms of identification and action, whereas critical representations often promote less glorifying patterns of identification and action. And in the present study, we considered the hypothesis that different representations of Columbus's voyage and the US colonial encounter might function as cultural tools that regulate national identity. And associated with this idea are two hypotheses. So in one direction, we considered the hypothesis that people selectively reproduce representations of history that resonate with their beliefs and desires. And to investigate this idea, we experimentally made salient the experience of national glorification, and we observed the effects of this treatment on people's selection and reproduction of collective memory or representations of history. And we predicted that the salience of national glorification will promote reproduction of celebratory representations that silence or deny instances of national wrongdoing. In the other direction, we considered the hypothesis that competing representations of history exert different effects on identity-relevant action. And to investigate this idea, we exposed participants to different sanitized or critical representations of the US colonial encounter, and we examined the effect of these representations on identity-relevant perception and action. We predicted that participants' perception of harm, support for reparative action, or tendencies to reproduce critical representations of history would be lower among participants exposed to sanitized representations as opposed to those participants exposed to more critical representations of history. So our sample, I think I'm missing a slide, there we go. Our sample included 75 participants who responded as white or European American in response to an item about ethnic identification. And participants completed a set of paper and pencil measures, and we assigned each participant at random to one of two historical representation conditions. And in the sanitized condition, participants read a text that described Columbus's discovery and the European settlement of the Americas, and it mentioned acts of expansion that Americans used to accomplish their manifest destiny, and described the resulting demographic transformation of the American continent as societal progress. In the genocide condition, participants read a text that described Columbus's arrival and European conquest of the Americas, and this text mentioned many acts of violence such as wars of conquest and forced removal in Americans' westward expansion, and construed the resulting demographic transformation on the continent as genocide. In addition to this treatment, we also assigned participants at random to one of two glorification salient conditions. So very briefly, participants in the glorification salient condition first filled out a national identification scale to highlight their sense of national glorification, and then proceeded to the rest of the questionnaires, whereas participants in the glorification not salient condition first completed the rest of the measures and completed the national identification scale last. So this measure that we used for glorification refers to the tendency to view one's national in-group as superior to other groups. So it's a very identity defensive type of national identification. A representative item of one of these 8 items is the US is better than other nations in all respects. The similar items similarly talk about this sense of superiority. And we gave these items to the participants and asked them to indicate their agreements with items like this on a 7-point response scale. Next, to assess participants' perception of harm after reading these genocide or sanitized texts, participants were asked to rate 3 items concerning the European conquest of North America. So these items were asking participants questions like how violent or brutal was the event, how many indigenous peoples died as a direct result of European settlers' actions, or to what extent was the collapse of indigenous societies due to deliberate policies of violence. These were line measures. Participants were given lines with these endpoints which said not violent at all to extremely violent, and they were asked to put an X on these lines, and then we measured the distance from one of the left actually endpoint to the place where they placed their X, calculated the distance, and then created the mean of these 3 items to create an index of perceived harm. Next, we asked participants 3 questions assessing their support for reparative action. 2 of these questions focused on national apology. So the United States should officially apologize to Native Americans for past treatments. And one of these questions focused on compensation and reparations, so for instance, giving land. Okay. Next, we were also interested in participants' tendency to reproduce critical or sanitized versions of history, so we devised 2 tasks. Immediately after participants read these sanitized or genocide texts, we asked them, in your opinion, what are the 5 most important items to commemorate during Native American History Month, which happens in November? And And participants were free to write open-endedly 5 historical items, and the way we coded these was by giving participants scores for every critical history item, okay, and subtracting points for any celebratory history item. The other task that we designed to assess participants' critical commemoration was a ranking task where we actually gave participants 10 items that concerned Native American history, and we asked them to rank these items in their order of importance for inclusion in textbooks, history textbooks for future high school students. And we had 4 critical items out of these 10 items, and for each of these 4 critical history items, we computed participants' mean rankings to obtain this critical commemoration importance score. And then, I don't want to get too much into the technical stuff, but we just basically created a composite measure by taking the standardized scores and creating an index of critical commemoration. So what you will see in the results will be a combination of these two. And to evaluate hypotheses, we use multiple regression analyses with glorification score, glorification salience, historical representation, and their interaction terms. And quickly to walk you through these results, first looking at analyses on perception of harm, what you can see here is, especially if you look at the black bars, you see that perception of harm was higher for participants who read a genocide text, and compared to the gray bars, those are the participants who read the sanitized text. And also, again in the expected direction, participants who filled out the glorification measure first, so for whom national glorification was salient, tended to perceive less harm than participants in the glorification not salient condition, but this relationship was actually qualified by an interaction which suggested that participants in the glorification salient condition, so whose sense of national glorification was primed, perceived less harm when they read a sanitized text than participants in the other groups. I'm not sure how I'm doing with the time, if I should go into interpreting these, or if I should move on with my results. Okay. Again. Okay, so looking at support for reparative action, which was one of our outcome measures related to national identity relevant action, we did not observe an effect of the critical representation, a direct effect of the critical representation of history on participants' tendency to support reparative action. But what we observed instead was an indirect effect of the critical representation on reparative action through participants' perception of harm. Okay, so this was actually true only for participants in the glorification salient condition. So even in this context of glorification salience, which might otherwise promote the denial of harm, the genocide text was still sufficient to preserve some perception of harm, which in turn made people support reparative action type policies more. Finally, looking at the critical commemoration results, the hypothesis was that the genocide framing of history might lead people to commemorate more critical versions of history, right? So we expected people to include more critical items when they were listing those Native American history months. And this was indeed true. However, this effect was weaker for participants in the glorification salience condition than those in the not salient condition. So the identity pressures were at work. And again, if we looked at participants who scored high or low on this national glorification measure, we realized that the hypothesized effect of the genocide representation was very strong for participants who did not indicate high levels of glorification. So for people who were low on this measure, they indeed, when they read a genocide text, indeed reproduced more critical versions of history, whereas that wasn't the case for people who scored high on this national glorification scale. So to put these things together, the results of the present research suggest the extent to which representations of history serve as cultural and psychological tools for collective identity regulation. And revisiting this idea of intentional worlds, from a cultural psychological perspective, we can say that representations of history serve as intentional worlds which reflect and promote identity-relevant action. Okay. So in the reflect direction, mainstream representations of US history carry a psychological charge associated with national glorification, and in the promote direction, representations of history direct action toward nation glorifying acts. So in conclusion, results suggest the potential social justice benefits of recovering silent memories or critical representations of history. So I would like to end with a quote by Martin Barreau, who noted in his writings for liberation psychology: prevailing discourse is put forth an apparently natural and ahistorical reality, structuring it in such a way as to cause it to be accepted without question. This makes it impossible to derive lessons from experience, and more important, makes it impossible to find the roots of one's own identity, which is as much needed for interpreting one's sense of the present as for glimpsing possible alternatives that might exist. The recovery of historical memory supposes the reconstruction of models of identification that, instead of chaining and caging the people, open up the horizon for them toward their liberation and fulfillment.